It was a surprisingly quiet autumn evening. I sat in my favorite worn armchair, a housewarming gift from my mother, and looked at the chessboard. The Black King was cornered, and checkmate was inevitable in 3 moves. My online opponent was slow to respond, apparently also realizing the hopelessness of the situation. I sipped my cooled tea from a mug bearing the logo of Greenwood University, where I was in my 8th year of teaching sociology. The clock showed the beginning of 11. Marilyn had been due back for another 2 hours, but lately, work delays had become commonplace for her. "There's no fixed schedule in the hotel business, Brad," she repeated every time I expressed concern. Perhaps she was right. I was used to a measured university life where everything goes according to a schedule. Lectures, seminars, counseling. Everything has its time and place. The game ended with my victory. The rating added 15 points, and I allowed myself a slight smile. A little more, and I would reach the cherished level of master on the platform. Chess has always been my refuge, a place where logic and strategy prevail over the chaos of everyday life. Marilyn never shared this passion, calling the game a waste of time for nerds. Perhaps she was right about that too. I am indeed a nerd, at least by her standards. The sound of the key turning in the lock snapped me out of my musings. Marilyn walked in as elegant as ever, even after a long day at work. Her brown hair was impeccably styled, and the faint scent of new perfume was in the air. "I'm sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Today was a nightmare day. A group from Japan had a real meltdown over booking problems." She kicked off her high-heeled shoes and sank tiredly onto the couch. "I made dinner. I can heat it up," I offered, closing my laptop. "No thanks, I had a snack at the cafe with Tamsin. You have no idea what a crazy day it's been." She ran a hand through her hair and reached for her phone, which immediately buzzed with a message. I watched as her fingers slid quickly across the screen and her face lit up for a moment with a slight smile. She used to smile like that at my messages. "I have an important meeting tomorrow with the new manager, Mr. Dunning. They say he's going to make some major changes to the hotel," she said without taking her eyes off the phone. "Good changes, I hope? You have to stay late as it is?" I tried to catch her gaze. "We'll see." She finally put the phone away. "And how was your day? Playing your chess again?" There was a familiar note of mild contempt in her voice that I began to notice more and more often. When we'd met 6 years ago at a charity event where I was giving a lecture on social inequality, she'd found my academicism endearing. "You're so smart and serious," she'd said then. Now, however, those qualities seemed to cause her only irritation. "Yes, but I've also finished a review for a scientific journal and prepared materials for tomorrow's lecture. We have a new French teacher coming in on Monday. We need to get her up to speed." I deliberately didn't mention the chess ranking, though I was still burning inside with the joy of victory. "A new teacher?" Marilyn showed interest in my words for the first time that evening. "Tell me about her." "Her name is Odette Pierce. She moved from Boston. The dean says she has excellent references." I shrugged, not understanding my wife's sudden interest in my work. Marilyn nodded thoughtfully and picked up the phone again. "I'm going to shower and go to bed. Tired like crazy." I watched her walk up the stairs to the 2nd floor of our small house. The house we'd bought 3 years ago, taking out a 30-year mortgage. It had seemed like a great idea at the time. A nest in a quiet neighborhood, only half an hour from the university, and 20 minutes from the Grand Plaza Hotel where Marilyn worked. Now, the house often seemed too big for two, especially in the evenings. I walked over to the window. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor, was still fiddling in the garden despite the late hour. Her husband had died 2 years ago, and gardening had become her way of coping with her loneliness. Every time I saw her at work in the garden, something clenched inside, maybe fear of my own future loneliness, which seemed more and more real lately. Lying in bed, I tried to remember when things had started to change. Maybe after we decided to put the baby plans on hold? Or when Marilyn was promoted to senior administrator? Or was the change so gradual that I just didn't notice it, like a frog doesn't notice water heating up? Marilyn emerged from the bathroom, fragrant with creams and lotions. She slid under the covers, habitually turning her back to the wall. "Good night, honey," she murmured. "Good night," I replied, looking up at the ceiling. In the darkness, the indicator light on her phone, lying on the bedside table, flashed. Another message. I closed my eyes, trying not to think about who could be texting her this late. After all, there really isn't a fixed schedule in the hotel business, I guess. Outside the window, the leaves of the maple tree we planted the first spring after we moved in were rustling. Back then, Marilyn had said she wanted our children to swing on its branches someday. Now the tree has grown, but we never built a playground under it. Monday morning, I woke up before my alarm clock. Marilyn was gone. She had left a note on the kitchen table saying she had an early meeting with the new manager. Her handwriting was hurried, the letters jumping, not at all like her usual neat handwriting. I ran my finger over the paper, noting the faint scent of her new perfume. The usual morning ritual: cinnamon oatmeal, a cup of strong coffee, a quick look at the news. The kitchen clock, a gift from my sister last Christmas, read 7:30. I had my first pair at 9, but today I had to get there early, to meet a new coworker. As I put on a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, my favorite, even though Marilyn called it a professor's parody, I noticed my wife had forgotten her day planner. The red leather cover peeked out from under a stack of magazines. She'd never left it at home before. She wrote down all her appointments, notes, even shopping lists in it. "Paper is more reliable than any gadget," she often said. It was unusually quiet at the university. Freshmen had not yet learned to arrive for their first class. I bumped into Odette Pierce in the lecture hall. She was a young woman with a short haircut and lively brown eyes. She was wearing a simple gray dress and a string of pearls, a classic look that somehow seemed very natural. "Professor Holloway?" She held out her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to help me get settled in." "Just Brad." I shook her hand, noting the firm handshake. It's rare to see that these days. Usually people barely touch each other, as if afraid of getting infected. I spent the next 2 hours showing her around the campus, explaining the schedule, the grading system, and the specifics of working with our students. Odette was an attentive listener, asking precise questions. She told me that she had taught at Boston University but moved here after her divorce. "Sometimes you need a fresh start," she said, and there was that special note in her voice that I often heard in the voices of people going through a difficult time. After lunch, I was checking student papers in my office when the phone rang. Marilyn. "Honey, I'm going to be late today. Mr. Dunning is having an informal meeting for the executive staff at the Blue Clam. You don't mind, do you?" The Blue Oyster was one of the most expensive restaurants in town. Marilyn and I had only been there once, for our 5th wedding anniversary. I'd been saving up for 2 months for that dinner. "Of course you haven't. How was this morning's meeting?" "Oh, Mr. Dunning, Wesley. He's got some terrific ideas for modernizing the hotel. He's worked in Europe, can you believe it? At the Ritz-Carlton chain." Her voice was ringing with excitement. I tried to remember the last time she'd spoken so enthusiastically about something related to me. "Glad you're doing well. Don't stay out too late." I tried to keep my voice sounding casual. "I won't. Love you." She disconnected before I could respond. That evening I sat at my chessboard, playing the Kasparov game that had recently been dealt with on the forum. The clock struck 11 when I heard a cab outside the house. The noise of the engine, laughter, the sound of heels on the walkway. I looked out the window. Marilyn was staggering out of the cab. A tall man in an expensive suit stood beside her, supporting her by the elbow. They talked about something, then laughed. The man leaned toward her, too close for business communication, and whispered something. Marilyn playfully poked him in the shoulder. I backed away from the window, feeling my heart leap out of my chest. The front door opened 5 minutes later. Marilyn hummed something to herself. "Oh, you're awake." She smiled, kicking off her shoes. She smelled like wine. "I'm sorry I'm so late. Time flew by unnoticed." "Who brought you here?" I tried to make the question sound casual. "Wesley. Mr. Dunning. He lives somewhere in this neighborhood, volunteered to give me a ride." She walked past me into the bathroom, lightly grazing the wall with her shoulder. A week later, Marilyn announced she was going to a 3-day hotel management seminar in Chicago. "Wesley thinks it will be good for me," she said as she tucked a new dress I hadn't seen before into her suitcase. There was nothing unusual about it, just another trip, one of many. The next morning I ran into Odette in the university cafeteria. She was sitting alone, checking students' papers. May I join you? I asked, holding a tray with a sandwich and coffee. Sure. She motioned her papers over. How's your paper on the effects of social media on family relationships coming along? I was surprised she remembered. We'd discussed it in passing during her first day. Slowly. It's hard to find time between lectures and checking papers. And chess? She smiled, nodding at the Fisher strategy book that was sticking out of my bag. Do you play? My father taught me when I was a kid. Really, I haven't practiced in a while. At that moment, my cell phone rang. A message from Marilyn. Had a good flight. The hotel is amazing. Important dinner with coworkers tonight. Don't miss it. I looked at the departure time. 14:30. It's 13:30 in Chicago right now. The flight she was calling me wasn't due to land until an hour later. Everything okay? Odette's voice brought me out of my reverie. Yeah, it's just... I fell silent, not knowing how to explain the vague unease that gripped me. Why don't we play a game? On Saturday, for example. I'd love to. Just don't be surprised when I win. She gathered up her papers and stood up. In the evening, I sat over the chessboard for a long time, but I couldn't concentrate. The pieces jumbled before my eyes, and my mind was spinning with scraps of thoughts. The too early message from Chicago, the new perfume, the new dress. Wesley thinks... The phone rang softly. A message from Marilyn, a picture of a luxurious hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan. Miss you, she wrote. I enlarged the photo. In the reflection of the window, I could make out the edge of the bed and someone's man's shirt on the back of a chair. Every morning I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, as if someone had placed a lead paperweight there from my desk. Marilyn returned from Chicago revitalized, with a new haircut and a little suntan. Strange for October Chicago. I didn't bother to ask about the shirt in the reflection. Maybe it was a play of light. Maybe I was just going crazy. That Tuesday was the first time I noticed people whispering behind me in the faculty lounge. Professor Mackenzie, with whom we'd worked on research together for years, suddenly began avoiding lunch together. And the faculty secretary, Mrs. Donovan, gave me a strange look when I was chatting with Odette about an upcoming chess game. I hear your wife has become the new superintendent's right-hand man, Mrs. Donovan said, defiantly shifting folders on her desk. Yes, she has a lot of new responsibilities, I replied, feeling uncomfortable with her studying gaze. They say he's a very attractive man, this Mr. Dunning. And divorced. She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. I pretended not to notice the hint and hurried into my office. There was a stack of freshman essays on social stratification on the desk, but I wasn't in the mood to check them. I opened the chess program. My rating had dropped 50 points in the last week. Too many mistakes, too scattered attention. In the evening, as I was getting ready to go home, Odette knocked on the office door. Did you remember Saturday? She asked, adjusting her shoulder bag. She was wearing a simple white blouse and a tweed skirt, an outfit Marilyn would have called hopelessly old-fashioned. Of course not. 2 o'clock at the Morning Ray Cafe? Great. And, Brad, she faltered, are you okay? You look tired. Just a lot of work. I tried to smile. At home, I caught up with Tamsin, Marilyn's friend. They were sitting in the kitchen with glasses of wine, and the conversation abruptly broke off when I walked in. Oh, Brad, Tamsin said with a strained smile. And here we are discussing the new hotel arrangements. Mr. Dunning, is such a demanding manager. Yes, honey, can you imagine we're going to have regular company outings from now on? Team building and all that? Marilyn spoke too fast, as if trying to fill the silence. This weekend, for example, Tamsin added, and immediately bit her tongue when she got another look from Marilyn. This weekend? I froze by the refrigerator. You didn't say. I was just about to. It's a mandatory event all the senior administrators have to attend. Marilyn took a big sip of wine. On Saturday? For some reason, that was the detail that caught me the most. Yes, Saturday through Sunday, Pine Hills Country Club. They have an amazing golf course. I remembered offering to spend a weekend at that club 6 months ago for our anniversary. It's too expensive, honey. We need to save money, Marilyn had said then. Listen. Marilyn walked over to me, putting a hand on my shoulder. I know we haven't spent much time together lately, But this job is very important to me. You understand, don't you? I nodded, unable to utter a word. Tamsin glanced defiantly at her watch. Oh, I have to go. Marilyn, don't forget to buy a new swimsuit. The club has a fancy pool. As she left, Marilyn began fussily putting away the glasses. Why didn't you tell me earlier about the weekend? The decision wasn't made until today. Besides, I thought you had some plans, didn't you? Something about chess? Where did you... Mrs. Donovan mentioned that you were going to play with that new girl. What's her name? Odette? An unfamiliar note appeared in her voice. Just a friendly game? Why did I suddenly feel the need to justify myself? Of course it is, sweetheart. She's very smart, I'm told. And cute. I remained silent as I watched her stack the glasses in the dishwasher. Carelessly, out of size, like she'd always done before. The next day at the university, Professor Jameson, the head of the English Literature department, approached me. Brad, do you have a minute? We walked into her office, littered with books and old photographs. Listen. She sat down at her desk with her hands folded in a house. Some talk about you and Miss Pierce. What? I felt the color flood my face. What kind of talk? You see, in academia, reputation is very important, and close relationships between colleagues. Wait a minute. I held up my hand. We're just colleagues. We're going to play a game of chess, that's all. Sure. She nodded doubtfully. Just keep in mind, people like to gossip. All day I couldn't concentrate. During the lecture, I mixed up the dates of important sociological studies, which had never happened to me before. After class, I sat in my office for a long time trying to figure out what was going on. In the evening, Marilyn called, Honey, there's an important weekend meeting today. Don't expect me for dinner. Where's the meeting? Pause. At the Blue Clam. Mr. Dunning feels that important matters are best discussed informally. Who else is coming? Brad. Her voice became irritated. Are you controlling me? No, just... I have to go. Don't stay up late. She disconnected. I opened the chess program, but I couldn't even start a game. Instead, I pulled out my phone and texted Odette. Sorry, but Saturday's meeting will have to be canceled. Her reply came a minute later. Sure, I understand. I hope everything is okay with you? I didn't answer. What could I say? That my wife might be dating a new supervisor? That there are rumors going around the university about me and the new faculty member? That I couldn't sleep at night listening to the sound of incoming messages on my wife's cell phone? That night, Marilyn came home past midnight. She smelled like cigarettes, even though she had quit smoking 3 years ago. Tough day, she muttered without looking at me and went straight into the shower. I lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the water, and thought that in chess everything was simple. There were rules, there was strategy, there was a clear understanding of who won and who lost. In life, everything turned out to be much more complicated. Friday night, I sat in our bedroom, mechanically putting Marilyn's things into her travel bag for a corporate retreat. A silk blouse I didn't remember, a new swimsuit with a tag from an expensive boutique, a translucent black dress, also unfamiliar. Each item was like a punch in the gut. When had she had time to buy them? How had she allowed herself to spend so much on our budget? Honey, you shouldn't have. I would have gotten ready myself. Marilyn came out of the bathroom, wrapping her hair in a towel. I remained silent, smoothing the creases in my dress. $150,000. The price on the tag stung my eyes. My monthly salary at the university. It's a gift, she said suddenly, noticing my gaze. From who? From the girls at work. It was for their birthday. Her birthday was 4 months ago. She'd gotten a bouquet of flowers and a gift card to a spa from her coworkers then. I remembered exactly. I'd picked her up from work myself that day. I'll probably be late to the university today, I said as I zipped up my bag. I need to get my materials ready for Monday. Sure, she started to put on her makeup at the mirror. And I'll go right after lunch. Mr. Dunning said it's best to get there early. Take a look around. I walked out of the bedroom, unable to hear that name again. In my office, I turned on my computer and opened the lectures folder, but I couldn't concentrate on the text. My fingers reached for the phone, open the browser, type in Pine Hills Country Club, Luxury complex, spa, golf, tennis courts, and the prices from $500 a night. Corporate team building, a must-do, Marilyn's voice echoed in my head. I did stay late at the university, but not because of lectures. I just couldn't bring myself to go home, to an empty house where every single thing would remind me of her, of us, of what was and what seems irretrievably lost. I ran into Odette in the hallway. She was coming out of the linguistics lab with a stack of books in her hands. "Brad, are you still here?" "Working." I tried to smile, but only a grimace came out. "You know," she paused, "I was going to have dinner at the Morning Ray. Would you like some company? You look like you could use a cup of hot tea." I wanted to refuse. I should have said no. But the thought of returning to an empty house was unbearable. The Morning Ray was almost empty by this time. We sat down at the corner table where Marilyn and I had once celebrated my promotion to associate professor. The waitress, the same one, Jenny, she'd been working here for 10 years, brought mint tea for Odette and black coffee for me. "Do you want to talk about it?" Odette asked, warming her hands against the cup. "About what?" "About what's troubling you. Sometimes it's easier to share with a relative stranger." I shook my head, but the words watered themselves. "Do you ever feel like reality is slipping away? That everything that seemed solid and secure is crumbling like a house of cards?" She was silent, giving me the opportunity to continue. 8 years of marriage. 8 years and suddenly, I stammered. "I'm sorry, you're not interested." "My husband left me for his college girlfriend," she said suddenly. "That's why I moved out of Boston. Sometimes you have to have the courage to face the truth." At that moment, my phone rang. A message from Tamsin. "I think you should see this." And a picture. It showed Marilyn and Wesley Dunning in the lobby of the Pine Hills. His arm around her waist, she's laughing with her head tilted back. She's wearing the same black dress. Time had stopped. I stared at the photograph, and the world around me floated like a watercolor painting in the rain. The sounds of the cafe came like through absorbent cotton. The clinking of dishes, muffled voices, music from the speakers, all blended into an unintelligible hum. "Brad?" Odette's voice broke through the fog. "What's wrong?" I silently showed her the phone. She glanced at the photo and quietly muttered in French. "I have to go." I stood up, nearly knocking over my cup. "You can't drive in this condition." She stood up as well. "I'll call a cab." "I'll drive you. No discussion." Her little Volkswagen smelled of lavender and leather. We drove in silence. I looked out the window at the city lights floating by and thought about how many times Marilyn had come home in a cab. From business dinners, from meetings, from corporate events. "Oh, park around the corner," I asked as we pulled up to the house. The bedroom light was on. I quietly opened the door with my key. There were voices coming from the kitchen. "He doesn't suspect anything," Marilyn's voice said. "Are you sure?" "It was Tamsin's. He's been kind of twitchy lately." "Brad's too immersed in his books and chess to notice anything. Besides, that new girl Odette, I hear they see a lot of each other." "And that doesn't bother you?" Marilyn's laugh is cold, alien. "Let her have her fun. It's even more comfortable that way. Wesley says there's an opening on the network for a Miami manager in a month. He's already hinted to management that I'm a candidate." "What about Brad?" "What about Brad? You think he'd trade his precious university for a move to Florida? And why would he?" "It'll be over by then." I staggered toward the door, trying not to make any noise. My legs were wobbling. I got to Odette's car and fell into the seat. "Take me somewhere. I don't care where." She silently started the engine. We drove through the city at night, past the lighted windows, past happy families eating dinner at their tables, past an entire life that was suddenly a mirage. "I have a couch," she said when we stopped in front of her house. That night I lay on someone else's couch, looking up at the ceiling, and thought about how, of all the pieces on a chessboard, the king is the most helpless. He can only make one move at a time, and more often than not is left alone against everyone. The morning started with the smell of coffee and an unfamiliar ceiling. For a few seconds I tried to figure out where I was. Odette's couch was surprisingly comfortable, though my whole body ached, not so much from the uncomfortable position as from the tension inside. On the coffee table was a cup of freshly brewed coffee and a note. Went for a run, back by 8. There's yogurt and fruit in the fridge. I looked at my phone's 6 messages from Marilyn, 2 missed calls. I didn't read it. Instead, I looked around Odette's apartment, small but cozy. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, old black and white photographs of Paris on the walls, a worn leather armchair by the window. No ostentatious luxury, nothing superfluous. In the corner there was a chess table with the pieces arranged. I came closer. The game was in full swing. Judging by the position of the pieces, Black was playing a complex defense against White's attack. There was a stack of student papers on the kitchen table. Odette must have been checking them late. Red marks in the margins, neat comments. I couldn't help but compare it to the last time I'd checked them. Sloppy, scattered. When was the last time I'd really read a student's work? The front door opened quietly. Odette had returned from her run, flushed from the morning chill. "How are you?" she asked, pouring herself some water. "I don't know," I answered honestly. Like a person who's lived in a made-up world all their life and suddenly had an epiphany. She nodded. "That's a familiar feeling. Would you like to talk about it?" "I'm not sure I can. Everything seems unreal." "Then let's have breakfast. Even sorrow seems bitter on an empty stomach." She pulled yogurt, fruit, and a fresh baguette out of a paper bag from the refrigerator. She must have bought it on the way. We sat in the small kitchen, drinking coffee, and I felt something resembling peace for the first time in a long time. "Is this your game?" I nodded at the chess table. "I play it with myself, helps me think." "And who's winning?" "Haven't decided yet. Sometimes it's good to look at both sides of a situation." There was some special meaning in her words, but I was too exhausted to catch it. The phone vibrated again. Marilyn. I pressed reject. "You know," Odette was spreading jam on a baguette. "When I found out about my husband and his student, I didn't leave the house for 3 days. I sat in my pajamas, ate ice cream, and watched French melodramas. And then? Then I realized that life doesn't end with betrayal. It hurts, it's unfair, but it's not the end. I have to go to university," I said, getting up. "On Saturday? I want to pick up some things from my office. I think. I'll give you a ride." "No." I shook my head. "I'll take a walk. Thanks for everything." She caught me at the door. "Brad, listen. What you found out? It's not your fault, remember that. On the way to the university, I counted my steps, trying to focus on simple actions. Left foot, right foot. Inhale, exhale. Not to think about how my whole life had turned out to be a stage set. Not to think about how long it lasted. Not to think about how many people knew and were silent." The campus was unaccustomedly empty. In my office, I mechanically gathered papers, books, personal belongings. The picture of Marilyn on the desk was from our wedding. Her smile seemed fake now. Or was that just what I wanted to think? How much truth was there in our relationship? How many lies? There was a knock on the door. I flinched. It was Mrs. Donovan. "Professor Holloway? This early on a Saturday?" "Yes, there's something I need to get ready." Of course, of course." She pursed her lips. "I've decided to get some work done, too. There's so much gossip, so much talk. It's just dizzying." I froze. "What kind of talk?" "Well," she lowered her voice, "they say you and Miss Pierce." "What?" "Well, you understand. And your wife, poor thing, is suffering so much. She called yesterday asking if anyone had seen you at the university." I felt the room begin to spin. Marilyn called here? Asking about me and Odette? "Mrs. Donovan," my voice sounded hoarse. "Who else was asking?" "Well, this nice girl, Tamsin, came by the other day. Kept asking about you and Miss Pierce, and took pictures of something on her phone while you were talking in the hallway." The puzzle was starting to come together. Photos, rumors, conversations. I sat down at my desk, feeling weak in my legs. The computer screen still had the chess program open. The last game, the one I'd lost a week ago. I had made the elementary mistake of letting my opponent lure me into a trap. Just like in life, the phone vibrated again. This time I opened the messages. "Honey, where are you? I'm worried. Please call me." Everyone says they saw you with that French girl. How could you do this to me? We need to talk. I know all about you and Odette. The last message came 5 minutes ago. I stared at the screen, and something inside was breaking the last remnants of illusions, the last belief that I could be wrong. The work phone rang on the desk. I knew it was Marilyn. She always called every possible number if I didn't answer my cell phone. It used to seem like a show of concern. Now I saw it only as a desire to control. I began methodically deleting her pictures from my computer desktop. One by one, our first meeting, the honeymoon, the housewarming. Each photo now seemed like a frame from a movie with actors playing their parts. Good actors? Professional? In the last picture, we were at the Blue Oyster, that 5th anniversary dinner. I remembered saving money on dinners to afford that evening. I remembered her delight when she saw the menu. I remembered her saying, "You're the best husband in the world." I wondered if she'd already planned it then. Did she know even then that one day she would be sitting at this same table with another man? I opened the mail and started writing a request for a leave of absence. 2 weeks, maybe a month. I needed time to think, to breathe, to reassemble the pieces of my life into some semblance of a whole. Footsteps were heard in the hallway. I knew those footsteps. Marilyn's. She always walked like that, confident, in heels, as if the whole world should listen to her approach. I shut down my computer, grabbed my bag and stuff, and went out the back exit. Odette's car was parked in the parking lot. "I thought you might need some help," she said as she opened the door. In the rearview mirror, I saw Marilyn coming out of the main entrance. She was wearing that very black dress. Odette took me to a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The place was so unremarkable that Marilyn would never have looked here. Scuffed couches, faded photos on the walls, the smell of freshly baked pastries and cheap coffee. "They brew the best Americano in town here," Odette said, ordering us both coffee. I nodded, unable to think about the taste of anything. My phone kept vibrating in my pocket. I reached for it, pulled out the SIM card, and placed both pieces on the table. The little piece of plastic that connected me to my past life. "You know," Odette stirred the sugar in her cup. "When I found out about my husband and his student, I did the same thing. Only I also threw my cell phone in the river. Did it help? No. But buying a new phone was easier than putting myself back together." I looked out the window. It was drizzling light rain. Passers-by were hurrying somewhere with umbrellas. A young couple was kissing at the bus stop. Just an ordinary Saturday afternoon. The world went on as if my life hadn't fallen apart. "I need somewhere to stay for a few days," I said without looking at Odette. "I have a couch." "No, it'll just give them more to gossip about." She nodded. "My brother has an apartment across town. He's in Europe for 6 months. I'm looking after the place. No one will find you there." An hour later, we were climbing the stairs of an old house in a neighborhood I'd never been to before. The apartment turned out to be a small studio overlooking the brick wall of a neighboring building. Minimal furniture, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a bookcase. On the table was an old chess set. "My brother plays too," Odette remarked, following my gaze. I walked over to the board. The pieces were old and worn, some slightly askew. I picked up the black king. There was a barely noticeable crack on it. "Thank you," I said, still holding the figure. "I'll get you some clean linens and towels, and some food. There's only a can of coffee and a packet of salt." When she left, I sat on the bed and let myself really feel the pain for the first time in 24 hours. It came in waves, squeezing my chest, catching in my throat. I lay down, curled up, and cried for the first time in years. I cried for the lost years, for the betrayal, for my blindness, for the man I had been and was no longer. I don't know how much time passed. There was a knock on the door. Odette returned with bags. I brought the essentials. Also, she pulled out a bottle of whiskey. "Sometimes you need that too." I shook my head. "I don't want to get drunk." "Then let's just have dinner. You haven't eaten all day." She laid out the food on a small table. Sandwiches, fruit, cookies. We ate in silence. It was getting dark outside the window. The rain intensified, drumming on the eaves. "What are you going to do next?" she asked finally. "I don't know. Probably need to talk to her. hear her side of the story. Why? To hear more lies? I stood up, walked to the window. In the reflection of the glass, I saw myself, wrinkled, aged, red-eyed. You know what the worst part is? I can't figure out when it all started. When did she stop loving me? Or never loved me? Maybe I was just a convenient option. Stable, reliable, predictable. Odette was silent, giving me a chance to speak. Or maybe this is about me. Maybe I was focusing too much on work, or not making enough money. Or, stop. She held up her hand. Don't do this. Don't look for excuses for betrayal. Don't take on someone else's guilt. I sank down in my chair, feeling absolutely devastated. I'm 42 years old, Odette. I wasted 8 years on a marriage that turned out to be a sham. What am I supposed to do now? Where do I start? From small things. She walked over to the chessboard. A game of chess, for instance. Now? Why not? When everything is falling apart, sometimes it's good to focus on the simple things. White or black? I looked at the board. At the black king with a crack. Black. We played until deep into the night. Odette proved to be a strong opponent, not making obvious mistakes, thinking several moves ahead. At some point, I caught myself that I was really focused on the game, that I briefly forgot about the pain. Around midnight, there was a knock on the door, loudly, insistently. "Brad, I know you're in there!" Marilyn's voice. Odette and I froze over the chessboard. The knocking was repeated. "Open up right now, we need to talk!" "How did she find us?" I whispered. "Probably followed me," Odette grumbled. "Brad, I know all about you and that French girl. How could you do this to me?" I felt a hysterical laugh come up to my throat. "She's blaming me? She is." "Don't open it," Odette said quietly. "She put on this show on purpose. I'm sure she didn't come alone." And indeed, another voice came from behind the door. Tamsin's. "Marilyn, honey, calm down. Let's call the police. Let everyone find out what he's really like." I went to the door, pressed my forehead against it. On the other side was the woman I'd loved for 8 years, the woman I trusted, the one I planned to grow old with. "Brad," Marilyn's voice grew quieter, trembling. "I'll forgive everything. Just come out, talk to me." I remained silent. There were 1,000 words, accusations, questions swirling around in my head, but I didn't say a word. "Well, sit there with your whore!" she suddenly shouted. "I'll tell everyone what a hypocrite you are. Everyone will know how you have fun with your students." The sound of receding footsteps, the clatter of heels on the stairs, the slam of the front door downstairs. I slid down the wall to the floor. Odette sat down next to me, not touching me, just being there for me. "You know what's weird?" I said after a long silence. "I still love her, or rather the woman she's been pretending to be all these years." "It'll pass," she replied quietly. "When?" "When you realize that loving a ghost is slow suicide." We sat like that until dawn. It was gradually getting lighter outside the window. The rain had stopped. There were still pieces on the chessboard, an unfinished game, as a symbol of my whole life. "I need to go home," I said, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the window. "Are you sure?" "No, but I have to do it. Pack my things, my papers, finish all this." Odette nodded. "I'll give you a ride. Just, maybe we should wait a little longer? Until she calms down?" I shook my head. 8 years I've waited. Enough. The house greeted me with an unaccustomed silence. Usually at this time, Marilyn was already preparing breakfast, humming something to the radio. The smell of coffee, the clinking of dishes, the sound of water in the shower. These were the morning symphony of our lives. Now the house seemed alien, lifeless. On the kitchen table stood an empty bottle of wine and 2 glasses. One had a lipstick mark on it. There was a mountain of unwashed dishes in the sink, cigarette butts in a coffee cup. Marilyn quit smoking 3 years ago. At least that's what I thought. Walking up to the bedroom, I froze in the doorway. The bed was unmade. Marilyn hadn't spent the night at home. On the dressing table were scattered cosmetics, an empty bottle of that new perfume, and a silver-framed photograph of us at the wedding. I took the picture, looked at our faces. So happy, so in love. Or was it just me who was in love? None of this is true. Her voice made me wince. I didn't hear her come in. Marilyn stood in the bedroom doorway, still in the same black dress, hair disheveled, makeup smeared. She smelled of cigarettes and alcohol. What exactly isn't true? I put the picture back up, trying to keep my hands from shaking. About me and Wesley, it's all gossip. Ugly, dirty gossip. She took a step into the room. But about you and that French girl? Marilyn, let's not do that. I know everything. You know what? She tried to laugh, but it came out hoarse, unnatural. About Miami, about your plans, about you and Tamsin spreading rumors about me and Odette. She froze. Fear flashed in her eyes for a second, but was immediately replaced by anger. Oh, so she's just Odette now? Not even Miss Pierce? That's nice. I started packing methodically, quietly, putting shirts and pants into an old suitcase, the same one we'd gone on our last trip together 2 years ago. What are you doing? Her voice trembled. Leaving. Going where? To her place? No, just leaving. She sat down on the bed, crumpled dress pulled up above her knees. Once such a gesture had driven me crazy. Now all I felt was tired. Brad, honey. Her tone changed, becoming soft, pleading. Let's talk about this. I know I was wrong. These delays at work, the business trips. But it's all for us. I wanted us to have more money to be able to afford... Enough. I zipped up my suitcase. Just enough. Is that all she told you? That French whore? Marilyn, I looked her in the eye. I heard your conversation with Tamsin, about Miami, about how you planned to end it all. She turned pale. For a second, the mask came off, and I saw the real Marilyn, calculating, cold. So you were eavesdropping? Her voice became hard. Spying on me? How did you spy on me? How did you send Tamsin to take pictures? How did you spread rumors at the university? She stood up, walked to the window, lit a cigarette, not even trying to cover up. You know what the funny thing is? She let out a jet of smoke. I really did love you. In the beginning, you were so, right, dependable, boring. Every word was like a blow, but I kept standing, listening. And then Wesley showed up, and I realized what I was missing. Passion, excitement, real life. While you were playing your chess, while you were digging through your books. Is that why you decided to ruin my reputation? To make me look guilty? She shrugged. It was easier that way. Everyone would understand. Poor woman, husband cheated with a young coworker. Classic story. At that moment, her phone rang. Wesley popped up on the screen. She didn't even try to hide it. Aren't you going to answer it? I asked. What's the point of hiding? You know everything. She answered the phone. Honey, I'll call you back later. Yeah, everything's fine. I looked at her. The beautiful, confident woman I thought I knew better than anyone in the world, who turned out to be a complete stranger. You know what the worst part is? I said, picking up my suitcase. Not the betrayal, not the lies. It's that you don't feel guilty even now. Guilt? She laughed bitterly. For what? For wanting more? For being tired of being the wife of a humble teacher? For... She was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. We both froze. It's Tamsin, Marilyn said. I called her. Why? To have a witness. In case you... She hesitated. There's not much that can happen in a fit of jealousy. I felt nausea coming up my throat. She'd thought of everything, even this. Goodbye, Marilyn. I picked up my suitcase and went to the door. Brad! She grabbed my arm. You can't just leave. We've had 8 years of marriage. 8 years of lies. I gently released my hand. Tamsin was standing on the doorstep with her phone in hand, ready to shoot another dirt video. But something in my face stopped her. You don't have to film, I said as I walked past. The show's over. Brad! Marilyn's voice caught up with me already on the street. If you leave, there's no turning back. I didn't turn around. I walked down the street where I knew every tree, every crack in the asphalt. I passed Mrs. Henderson's house, who was tending to her garden. She waved at me, but I only nodded. I didn't have the energy for a simple greeting. The phone in my pocket vibrated a message from Odette. How are you? Alive, I texted back. I sat down on a park bench where Marilyn and I had once enjoyed weekend walks. I took out of my suitcase the tattered chess set I'd brought from home. My first tournament set, a gift from my father. I set up the pieces, watching the sun play on the faded sides of the pawns. Somewhere I made a mistake, missed an attack, allowed myself to be cornered. The phone vibrates again. Marilyn, I'm filing for divorce and don't think you'll just walk away. I have proof of your cheating. I looked at the chessboard. At the black king cornered by the white pieces. The game was lost. But it wasn't the last game of my life. Gathering my pieces, I got up from the bench. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in many days I knew exactly where I was going. Monday morning I awoke to a call from Marilyn's lawyer. The voice in the receiver, cold, professional, informed me that my wife was filing for divorce, accusing me of adultery. I listened to the enumeration of evidence photos, witness statements, even some printouts of messages I'd supposedly written to Odette. It was all lies, but so convincing, lined up, backed up with details. My client is willing to settle, the lawyer said, provided you don't lay claim to the house and agree to her terms on the division of property. I sat on the bed in Odette's brother's apartment, clutching my phone. The house we'd bought together, the one I was still paying the mortgage on, where every nail had been hammered in with my hands. Think about it, the lawyer continued. Otherwise, we'll be forced to turn over evidence of your association with Miss Pierce to the university authorities. After the call, I sat still for a long time. My mind was reeling with scraps of thoughts, memories. Marilyn and I picking out wallpaper for the bedroom, planting maple trees in the yard. Here we are celebrating a housewarming party. Was it all a lie? Even then? My hands shook as I tried to pour myself a cup of coffee. The cup slipped out, shattering on the floor. I stared at the shards and suddenly started laughing, hysterically, uncontrollably. Then the laughter turned to sobs. I slid down the wall to the floor, ignoring the shards, and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. The doorbell rang, snapping me out of that state. Odette stood on the doorstep with a bag of groceries. I thought you might need... She stopped talking when she saw my face. What's wrong? I told her about the lawyer's call. She listened in silence, only the jaundices on her cheekbones moving. And what are you going to do? I don't know. Maybe just go along with it. What difference does it make now? She walked to the kitchen, saw the broken cup, silently began picking up the shards. There is a difference, she said, tossing the shards into the trash. If you give up now, they win. Not just the house. They'll steal your reputation, your dignity. My reputation is already... No. She turned to me sharply. Until you believe their lies yourself, nothing is over. At that moment, the phone rang again. The university's number. Professor Holloway? The dean's voice sounded strained. We need to talk. 2 o'clock today in my office. I glanced at my watch. 11 in the morning. She's already sent them the proof, I said, disconnecting. Then we need to act. Odette pulled out her phone. By 2 o'clock, we were at the university. Tamsin was already sitting in the dean's reception area, with a folder of papers in her lap, with the same smile I now hated. Oh, Professor Holloway. She made a surprised face. What a meeting. Odette sat down across from her, defiantly pulled out her phone and turned on the recording. What are you doing? Tamsin frowned. Recording it, in case you decide to tell any more lies. The office door opened. The dean, an older man with a graying beard, looked weary. Come in, everyone, he said. Marilyn was already sitting in the office, impeccably dressed with perfect hair. Next to her was Wesley Dunning, in an expensive suit with a cocky smile. Professor Holloway, the dean began, we've received some very serious allegations. Wait, Odette interrupted. She pulled out a flash drive. Listen to this first. She turned on the tape, a conversation between Marilyn and Tamsin in the cafe, where they were discussing a plan to discredit Odette and me. The recording was clear, every word heard clearly. I watched Marilyn's face, the way it changed from smug to frightened, the way her fingers dug into the armrests of the chair. It's illegal, she shouted. So is slander, Odette replied calmly. I've got more. She pulled out a second phone. She turned on a video. Tamsin taking pictures of me and Odette in the university hallway, then calling someone. Yes, did as you asked, Marilyn. Now let's send this. The dean raised his hand, stopping the recording. That's enough. His voice became hard. Mrs. Holloway, Miss Rutledge, Mr. Dunning, I think you'd better leave. Marilyn stood up, her knees trembling. Brad, she turned to me. I can explain. Don't. I didn't even look at her. When they left, the dean sighed heavily. Professor Holloway, Miss Pierce, I apologize for believing. You don't have to. I stood up. I felt devastated, but strangely calm. We walked out of the university on a cool fall day. The wind was driving yellow leaves down the paths. How did you do that? I asked Odette. I have friends at that cafe where they used to meet. Maybe I followed Tamsin for a bit. She smiled slightly. Thanks, I looked at her. For everything. You're welcome, just don't let them steal your life. That evening, I sat in Odette's brother's apartment, arranging the pieces on the chessboard. For the first time in a long time, my hands weren't shaking. There was a knock at the door. It was Odette with a bottle of wine. Thought there was an occasion tonight, she said. We sat by the window, drank wine and talked. About books, about Paris, about chess. Not a word about Marilyn, not a word about betrayal. The phone was silent. I'd blocked all the numbers. Tomorrow I would have to find a lawyer, start divorce proceedings, deal with the house. But that would be tomorrow. Shall we play? Odette nodded at the chessboard. Let's, I smiled. For the first time in days, it was a real smile. We arranged the pieces, white and black, good and evil, just like in life, only the rules are fairer here. You know, I said, making the first move, I realized one thing. When you lose everything, you start to see what's really important. And what's important? The truth. Even if it hurts. She nodded, moving the piece. Your move. A month passed. The trees had completely shed their leaves, and the first frost covered the lawns in silvery frost. I sat in the lawyer's office looking over the divorce papers. The final touches, the last signatures, and 8 years of life would turn into dry, legal language. She agreed to an equal division of property, said Mrs. Bergman, my attorney, adjusting her thin-rimmed glasses. After the tapes surfaced, let's just say her position became more reasonable. I nodded, running my pen over the paper. Marilyn was no longer threatening the university, no longer trying to smear my reputation. I'd heard from Tamsin that she'd quit her job at the hotel ostensibly of her own volition, though there were rumors that management wasn't thrilled about the scandal. Wesley Dunning did get a promotion and a transfer to Miami, alone, without Marilyn. Sign here and here. Mrs. Bergman pointed to the blank lines. I signed, sprawling, confident. Not like a month ago, when my hands shook with every phone call. Leaving the lawyer's office, I headed for the park, the same park where Marilyn and I used to like to walk. Now there were new benches, a playground, and a small cafe. Life had moved on. In the cafe, I ordered an Americano and sat by the window. On a neighboring table was a newspaper forgotten by someone. On the last page was an ad for a house for sale. Our house. Marilyn had decided to get rid of it as soon as we agreed on the division of property. My phone vibrated. A message from Odette. Don't forget about the chess tournament on Friday. You promised to participate. I smiled. After that incident in the dean's office, we started to communicate more. Not as lovers, no. The wounds were too fresh for a new relationship, but as friends who understood each other without too many words. The phone rang, interrupting my musings. Marilyn. Hi. Her voice sounded different. Without the usual confidence, without the manipulative softness I'd now learned to recognize. Hi. Yeah, signed the papers. I know, me too. Silence. A rustle on the other end of the line. She always rubbed her hair when she was nervous. Brad, there's something I need to say. You don't have to. You do. She took a deep breath. I really loved you. In the beginning, you were real, honest. Maybe too honest for someone like me. I looked out the window at the passers-by hurrying about their business. You know what the worst part is? I said finally. I loved you too, all the way to the end, even when I already knew the truth. She sobbed quietly. Wesley, he went to Miami alone, said I was too toxic for his career. I'm sorry. And it was true. Despite everything, I did feel sorry for her. No, you don't, and rightly so. I deserved it. I deserve everything. Marilyn, you know what I realized? Her voice got stronger. I've spent my whole life chasing something big, bright, festive, and the real happiness was right there. In our evenings with Chess, in your stories about work, in— Stop, I interrupted her. Don't need this. Don't need it anymore. In the evening, I returned to my new apartment, small but bright, on the third floor of an old building. There were no photos together, no memorable trinkets, no traces of a past life. Just books, a chessboard, and an old chair I had taken from home. On the table was a stack of student papers. For the first time in a long time, I felt the strength to really read them, to give detailed comments, to help my students grow. The phone rang, the dean. Professor Holloway, how would you feel about heading up a new research project? The grant has already been approved. The topic is the impact of social media on interpersonal relationships in modern society. I looked at the chessboard where the game I'd been parsing since morning was laid out. You know, I said, let's discuss the details tomorrow. I have some ideas. After talking, I sat down at the board. White started and won in 6 moves. A beautiful, clean combination. Like life, when you know the rules and play fair. There was a knock at the door. Odette had brought the promised French sociology books. How'd it go? She asked, noticing the divorce papers on the table. Strange, I shrugged. Sometimes an ending is just a new beginning. She walked over to the chessboard. Interesting position. Does White win? Yes, if they make the right choice. She smiled. It's like that in life too. It all depends on what move you make next. Shall we play? I asked, starting to arrange the pieces. I'd love to. Odette sat down across from me. Just don't give in. Never.